The Brooklyn street was quieter than usual that night. Elise Whitmore was walking home after a late shift at the bar. The worn heels of her shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk, the smell of beer and liquor still clinging to the apron she'd shoved in a hurry into her old backpack. She was tired. She was hungry. And all she wanted was to make it back to her tiny rented room so she could collapse onto the bed. Then she heard it. A trembling voice. The voice of an elderly man, lost and frightened, rising in the emptiness of the street. I don't know where I am. Please, can someone help me? Elise could have kept walking. She'd lived long enough in a world that wasn't kind to her to believe she still owed kindness to anyone else. Most people would have lowered their heads, put in their earbuds, and quickened their pace. But that wasn't what happened. Elise stopped. Less than 20 steps away, 3 young men were surrounding an old gentleman with hair as white as silver, wearing a rumpled button-down shirt fastened wrong, his feet in a pair of house slippers. He clearly didn't belong on this street at this hour. He clearly didn't know where he was. And clearly, the 3 who were pressing him into the wall didn't care. What happened in the next few minutes would make those 3 young men run from a girl who weighed less than 55 kilograms. But that still wasn't the most significant part. The most significant part was what Elise didn't know. That old gentleman was the father of one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York, and the choice she made to stop that night would change her life in a way she could never have imagined. If this story touched you, please hit like to show your support. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this every day. Now, to understand why a broke bar server would dare to face 3 men on a dark street, why she was willing to take a beating to protect an old man she'd never met, and why that decision would place her in front of the city's underworld kingpin, we need to go back to that morning. Every morning, the first thing Elise saw was the long scar on her left wrist. It ran from the base of her hand up toward her elbow, paler than it was in the beginning but never gone, the way the memory of that night never went away. She lay still for a few more seconds, on the thin mattress placed directly on the floor, listening to the ceiling fan creak overhead, listening to the steady drip from the kitchen faucet she'd reported to the landlord 3 times and no one had fixed. Elise's studio was so small that if she stood in the middle of it and spread her arms, she could touch both walls. A tiny kitchenette sat jammed into the corner, an old refrigerator humming all night, but inside it was almost empty. Only half a carton of milk nearing its expiration date, and a few slices of bread she knew were past the date printed on the package, but she still couldn't bring herself to throw away. She pushed herself upright, her feet meeting the cold tile, and stepped into a bathroom no bigger than a closet. The mirror hanging on the wall was cracked in one corner, reflecting a 27-year-old face, but eyes that were far older than their years. She looked at the scar on her arm in the mirror. 8 years earlier, the car her mother was driving flipped on Interstate 78 at 11 o'clock at night. Elise had been in the passenger seat, 19 years old, just finishing a shift at a supermarket. She didn't remember the impact. She only remembered waking up to find herself hanging sideways against the ceiling of the overturned car, her left arm trapped between metal and shattered glass, warm blood running down toward her wrist. Her mother was pinned on the other side, the driver's seat crushed and twisted into her body. Elise could hear her mother breathing, heavy, broken, coming in pieces. Elise crawled out through the shattered window, her arm tearing open against the jagged glass, but she didn't feel pain. She only felt fear. She stood in the lane, screaming, waving both hands. Cars drove past. Headlights swept across her face and slid away. No one stopped. 11 minutes. Later, a doctor told her that if someone had called for help 5 minutes earlier, her mother could have lived, but no one called. No one stopped. And her mother died before the ambulance arrived, right there in the overturned car in the middle of the night, less than an arm's length from her daughter. Elise survived with the scar on her wrist, and another scar, far larger, in a place no one could see. She left the bathroom, pulled on an old t-shirt, and looked up at the wall across from the bed. There was only one photo, taped there with a strip of tape. In it, she was 6 years old, sitting on her mother's lap, both of them smiling. It was the only thing left from her life before. Elise's father left when she was 7. One morning he was still at the kitchen table, and by afternoon when she came home from school, his closet was empty, his car keys left on the kitchen counter. No letter, no explanation. Her mother didn't cry in front of Elise, but that night, Elise heard her mother crying through the thin wall. He never came back. He never called on her birthday. He didn't show up at her mother's funeral. Elise grew up with empty hands and a mother who worked 2 jobs to raise her. Then that mother was taken, too, in those 11 minutes when no one stopped. After her mother died, Elise tried to hold on to college for a year. But tuition, rent, food, there was no one to pay for any of it except her. She dropped out halfway through her 2nd semester, not because she didn't want it, but because she had to choose between textbooks and dinner. Then she met a man. He was good at first, the way they're all good at first. But in the 3rd month, he hit her for the first time. She stayed for 2 years because she had nowhere else to go. When she finally left, she carried 1 bag of clothes and a body full of bruises she hid under long sleeves all summer. After that, she found a free self-defense program for women who'd been abused. 2 years of Krav Maga. 2 years for her body to learn how to strike back instead of curling inward. 2 years to understand these hands weren't made only to endure. Now, at 27, Elise worked 2 jobs. By day she cleaned rooms at a hotel. By night she served at a bar. Both paid minimum wage, and both exhausted her in different ways. She sat on the bed, held her phone, and dialed her landlord's number. 3 rings. 4 rings, he answered. And before Elise could finish her first sentence, his voice cut in, cold and clipped. 2 months of rent, due by the weekend, no exceptions. Elise tried to say more, tried to explain that she'd be paid on Friday, that she only needed 1 more week. But the line went silent. He hung up. Elise sat there, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the long, hollow tone. Then she lowered her hand, looked at the scar on her wrist, closed her fist until her knuckles went white. She drew in 1 long, slow breath, the kind she'd taken 1,000 times before, whenever everything became too heavy. Then she told herself, so softly it was almost nothing at all, just 1 more day. Elise didn't know this would be the last normal shift of her life. She arrived at Pauline's bar at 6 o'clock in the evening, 15 minutes early as always, pushing the heavy wooden door open with her shoulder, because both hands were full, one holding her backpack, and the other gripping the bag with her spare shoes. The bar sat on a corner in a neighborhood that wasn't the worst, but no one would ever call it good either. The kind of place where the neon sign flickered with a missing letter, and the leather stools along the counter were split open but nobody bothered to replace them. Pauline stood behind the bar, salt and pepper hair twisted into a high bun, black apron on, pouring beer for a regular. She was 52, running this place alone since her husband walked out 13 years ago, and she had a way of speaking that made newcomers think she hated the whole world. But Elise knew better. Pauline was the only person who'd fronted Elise her wages before payday without asking why. Pauline was the one who slipped an extra boxed meal into the staff refrigerator every Thursday night, because she knew that was the day Elise usually ran out of money for food. Pauline never said any of it out loud. She just did it, then turned away as if nothing had happened. Elise changed into her apron, tied her hair into a ponytail, and started her shift. Joe was already there, wiping down tables in the back. Jolene, 28, hair dyed red with dark roots, was the kind of person who talked more than she worked. But she was also the only one who asked Elise, "You okay?" and actually meant it. Joe looked up when she saw Elise and narrowed her eyes. "You look like you didn't sleep." Elise shrugged. "When do I ever look different?" Joe didn't smile. "I'll drive you home tonight. My car's finally fixed." But by 9 o'clock, Joe frowned at her phone. The mechanic had texted, the car still wasn't ready. She'd have to wait until tomorrow. Joe turned to Elise with an apologetic look. Elise shook her head before Joe could even say sorry. "It's fine. I'm used to walking." The bar was busier than usual for a Thursday night. Elise carried beers, poured whiskey, wiped the counter, took cash, wiped the counter again, carried more beers. Her body ran on autopilot, her feet moving between tables while her mind stayed somewhere else, counting rent money, hearing the landlord's cold voice from that morning's call, imagining the thin wall between her and the street if she didn't have the money by the weekend. Around 10 o'clock, a man sitting at the far end of the bar called her over. He'd been drinking hard since he came in, eyes bloodshot, grinning to himself. When Elise set his beer down in front of him, he grabbed her wrist, not hard, but not accidental either. His fingers pressed right into the line of scar beneath her sleeve. Elise didn't yank her hand back. She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. 2 years with a man who knew how to use his fists had taught her that pulling away only made them grip tighter. And the 2 years of Krav Maga afterward had taught her she got to choose how she responded. She looked him straight in the eye, calm, then used her other hand to peel his fingers off her wrist one by one, slowly and firmly, like unscrewing a bolt. She didn't say a word. He stared at her, his grin fading, because what he saw in Elise's eyes wasn't fear. It was pure exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that belonged to someone who'd faced worse than him and was still standing here. Before he could say anything, Pauline's voice cut across the room from the other end of the bar, sharp as a blade. "Get out!" The man turned toward Pauline. She stood there with both hands braced on the counter, the look of someone who'd thrown 100 drunk men out of this place and was ready to throw out one more without a second thought. He dropped money on the bar, stood, and staggered to the door without looking back. Pauline watched until the door slammed shut, then turned to Elise. "You okay?" Elise nodded. "I'm fine." Pauline studied her for a few seconds, the look of someone who wanted to say more but knew Elise didn't want to hear it. Then she went back to pouring beer like nothing had happened. But when the shift was almost over, Pauline stood beside Elise while she changed her shoes, her voice lower than usual, less gruff than usual. "Be careful on your way home. It's cold tonight." Elise smiled, the kind of smile only someone who understood Pauline would recognize as thank you. 11 o'clock at night. Elise pushed the door open and stepped outside. Cold air hit her in the face, carrying the damp smell of asphalt and a faint ribbon of cigarette smoke from somewhere down the block. She pulled the zipper of her hoodie up to her chin, the gray hoodie washed to a faded softness, one she'd bought at a thrift store for $2 3 years earlier. She put in her earbuds, turned on a quiet song, but wore only the left one. The right stayed empty. It was a habit she'd built since the day she started walking home alone after midnight. Always keep one ear for the world around you. Always listen. Always know who's behind you, which car is slowing down, which footsteps are getting closer. She started walking, her pace steady, not fast, not slow, the worn heels of her shoes tapping lightly on the sidewalk. Brooklyn at night had its own kind of quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the quiet of something holding its breath. Elise was used to that quiet. She'd walked through it hundreds of nights, and nothing had ever happened. Until tonight. As Elise stepped out into the dark Brooklyn street, 15 miles away, in a 3-story mansion on the Upper East Side, Arthur Maddox was sitting in the living room trying to remember what day it was. He was 72, his white hair combed back, though a few stubborn strands still fell across his forehead. His face, once very handsome, now carved with deep wrinkles like the map of a long life, whose roads he was slowly forgetting one by one. He wore a white button-down shirt fastened wrong. The second button slipped into the third buttonhole so the collar sat crooked, but he didn't notice. On his feet were house slippers, the soft kind embroidered with the letter A that Margaret, his wife, had bought for him years ago. On his left wrist was the gold watch he never took off, not even to sleep, not even to bathe, not even on the worst days when he forgot his own son's name. On the back of the watch were 4 engraved words, M and A, forever. Margaret and Arthur, forever. It had been Margaret's wedding gift to him 46 years earlier, and it was the last thing he still remembered clearly, even as his mind slowly erased everything else. The living room was large, the ceilings high, the furnishings expensive but not cold, because Margaret had filled it with family photographs and small flower pots on the windowsills. On the table beside Arthur's chair were 3 things: the wedding photograph of him and Margaret, a smaller photo of KL at 4 years old grinning wide on his father's shoulders, and an orange pill bottle with the cap already off. Mrs. Daly, Arthur's private nurse, was in the kitchen preparing water for him to take his medication. She was 60, short silver hair, round built, and she'd been caring for Arthur for nearly 3 years, long enough to know his habits by heart. She knew he liked the left chair by the window. She knew he touched his watch when he was anxious. She knew he often called Margaret's name in the evening because that was when he missed her most. But Mrs. Daly didn't know that today, inside Arthur's mind, it wasn't Thursday night. Inside his mind, today was Sunday morning. And on Sunday mornings, he and Margaret always went to the bakery. His memory was disappearing in large pieces, but Sunday mornings at the bakery remained intact, sharp down to the smallest detail, like a little island not yet swallowed by the rising sea. He remembered the smell of croissants fresh from the oven, the golden crust crisp with butter shining under warm lights. He remembered Margaret sitting across from him, breaking the pastry in half, offering him one piece and keeping the other, smiling with her mouth and with her eyes. He remembered how she would say, This half for you, this half for me, just like everything we have. He remembered so clearly he could smell the pastry right there in the living room, hear Margaret's laughter close to his ear, and he was certain she was waiting for him at the bakery right now, wondering why he was late. Mrs. Daly went into the kitchen to get the water. 10 minutes. She was gone for only 10 minutes, but 10 minutes was enough. When she came back into the living room with the glass of water in her hand, the chair by the window was empty. The pill bottle was still there. The wedding photo was still there. But Arthur was gone. The back door leading out to the garden was cracked open, the garden lights spilling into the darkness beyond. Mrs. Daly set the glass down, hurried to the door, and looked out across the garden. No one was there. She called his name. There was no answer. She grabbed her phone, her hands beginning to shake, and dialed Cale. By then, Arthur had reached the street. He walked to the end of the block, his house slippers scuffing on the sidewalk, his misbuttoned shirt fluttering in the night wind. He saw a yellow taxi and lifted his hand. The driver stopped. Arthur slid into the back seat, and when the driver asked where he was going, Arthur gave the name of a street in Brooklyn. 6 years earlier, that street had been where the bakery was, the one he and Margaret visited every Sunday. But 6 years was a long time. The bakery had closed the year Margaret began chemotherapy. The driver took him through Manhattan, over the bridge, into Brooklyn. When they arrived, Arthur looked out the window and reached into his pocket for his wallet. There was no wallet. He couldn't remember what he'd brought with him when he left the house. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, saw a 72-year-old man in a misbuttoned shirt and house slippers, eyes wide and lost, and told him to get out, no charge. Maybe the driver felt sorry for him. Maybe the driver just wanted to avoid trouble. Arthur stepped out and stood on the sidewalk, looking up. Where the bakery had once been was now a shop selling used electronics. The metal gate pulled down, a Spanish sign he couldn't read. He looked left, then right, then turned in a slow circle. No bakery. No smell of croissants. No Margaret waiting with her smile and a pastry broken in half. He stood there on a Brooklyn sidewalk, close to midnight, in house slippers, in a crooked button-down shirt, his hand on the gold watch at his wrist like a talisman, and he called, soft at first and then louder, again and again, the one name his mind never forgot. Margaret, Margaret, where are you? Margaret. No one answered. The street was empty. The wind was cold, and from the far end of the road, 3 shadows were moving toward him. Those 3 shadows had names. Trey, 24, led the way, the tallest of the 3, the sides of his hair shaved close, dressed in a black hoodie, walking with the swagger of someone who believed he owned any street he stepped onto. Shane, 23, hair dyed a glaring platinum under the streetlights, walked on Trey's left, always smiling, but the smile never reached his eyes. Dustin, 22, the smallest one, trailed a step behind, the quietest, yet always in exactly the right place to block someone's path when Trey gave the signal. None of them had steady work. None of them had a plan for tomorrow. They had only tonight. And whoever was unlucky enough to be alone on the street at this hour. They'd been roaming since early evening, up and down 3 or 4 different blocks, looking for the kind of person Trey called an opportunity. Opportunity meant someone weaker than them, more alone than them, more afraid than them. And when Trey saw Arthur Maddox standing on the sidewalk in house slippers, an expensive white shirt buttoned crooked, a gold watch glittering on his wrist under the streetlight, his mouth moving as he mumbled someone's name, Trey knew he'd found tonight's opportunity. Trey moved in first. His footsteps were deliberately heavy, deliberately loud, the kind of walk meant to make the other person hear him coming. Hey, old man, where you headed at this hour? Walking around alone this late is dangerous. His words could have sounded friendly if you listened only to the language, but the tone wasn't. Arthur turned, blinking fast, trying to process the unfamiliar face in front of him. He didn't recognize Trey, and he didn't understand why someone was speaking to him. In his mind, there was only one thing: Margaret. He needed to find Margaret. I'm looking for my wife, Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly but polite, the politeness of an older generation that addressed strangers with courtesy even when afraid. Her name is Margaret. She's waiting for me at the bakery. I can't find the bakery. Shane stepped up beside Trey, his half-smile widening. Margaret? You're confused, old man. What bakery is open for you at this hour? Arthur backed up a step, his spine nearly brushing the streetlight pole. He was beginning to understand these men weren't here to help him. even if his brain couldn't make sense of exactly why. He could only feel it, with some primitive instinct the illness hadn't erased, that he was in danger. Dustin moved without a sound, circling behind Arthur and stopping about 3 steps back, cutting off the way out. Now the 3 of them had Arthur in a half circle, not fully closed, but enough for him to know he couldn't move in any direction without running into one of them. Trey's eyes dropped to Arthur's wrist, the gold watch, the streetlight reflected off the face, glinting. "Nice watch, old man," Trey said, his voice changing, no longer pretending to be friendly. "Let me see it." And before Arthur could react, Trey yanked his wrist, grabbed the watch, and pulled hard. Arthur didn't let go. 72-year-old hands, joints that ached every morning, but he didn't let go. He clutched the watch with both hands, with whatever strength was left in his aging body, with something stronger than physical strength. "Don't!" Arthur's voice cracked. "Margaret gave that to me. She gave it to me on our wedding day. Please don't take it. Please don't." Shane laughed louder. Trey didn't laugh. He looked at the old man gripping the watch with trembling hands, and with his other hand he shoved Arthur. A hard, decisive shove, his full palm driving into Arthur's chest. Arthur fell backward. His right knee hit the sidewalk first, then his hand slapped down, skin scraping against rough concrete. The watch slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the pavement, the face striking the ground, a crack splitting across the glass. Arthur stayed there on both knees on the cold ground, staring at the watch less than a handspan away. The face cracked, the hand still moving. He reached for it, his fingertips brushing the metal edge, and from his mouth came a sound the 3 men standing over him couldn't understand the value of. "Margaret," he called, not calling for his wife to come save him, calling the way someone calls the name of the person they love most when they no longer know what else to hold on to. "Margaret." Trey stood there looking down at the old man on the sidewalk, reaching for the cracked watch, calling the name of a woman who would never come, and he felt nothing at all. Elise heard it before she saw it. Not screaming, not a clear cry for help, but someone calling a name, over and over, weak and misplaced in the emptiness of the street. "Margaret. Margaret." She pulled out the earbud from her left ear, slowed, and tilted her head to listen. The voice was coming from ahead, about 20 steps away, where a streetlight spilled a bright circle onto the sidewalk. And inside that circle of light, Elise saw everything. An old man with white hair was on his knees on the ground, his knees scraped, both hands reaching towards something that glinted on the concrete, a white shirt buttoned crooked, house slippers. And 3 young men stood around him, one in front, one to the left, one behind, forming a half circle, looking down at him the way you look at an animal caught in a trap. Elise's stomach tightened. Her pace stuttered for a beat, then stopped. She stood there 20 steps from the scene, and inside her head 2 voices began to fight. The first voice said, "Keep walking. It's not your business. You're just a bar server. You're exhausted. You're hungry. You're 2 months behind on rent. There are 3 men over there and you weigh less than 55 kilograms. Keep walking. Lower your head. Move faster. Like everyone always does." The second voice didn't speak. The second voice only played a film Elise had watched thousands of times inside her mind for 8 years. Every night before sleep, every morning when she looked at the scar on her wrist, the film began with the sound of metal folding in on itself, glass exploding, the roar of Interstate 78 at 11 o'clock at night. Elise, 19 years old, hanging sideways in an overturned car, blood running warm from her left wrist toward her elbow, then cooling. Her mother in the other seat, breathing hard, broken, calling Elise's name as the voice grew smaller. Elise crawling out through the shattered window frame, glass cutting her skin, but she didn't feel it. Elise standing, unsteady, in the lane, and screaming. She screamed until her voice turned raw, until her throat tore from the inside. Cars passed. The first one. Headlights swept across her face, a flash of blinding white, then gone, then gone. The second, slower, just enough for Elise to believe they would stop, just enough for her to run toward those headlights, but then the car sped up and vanished into the dark. The third, the fourth, the fifth, she counted. She remembered counting because she didn't know what else to do except count. 11 minutes. Headlights swept over her face and moved on. Swept and moved on. Swept and moved on. 11 minutes, and no one stopped. When the ambulance finally came, the paramedics ran to the overturned car, and Elise stood at the edge of the road, one hand gripping her bleeding wrist, watching them pull her mother out. She saw her mother's face. She knew. She knew before anyone said a word. Later, at the hospital, a doctor explained in a gentle, professional voice that her mother had internal injuries, that if help had arrived 5 minutes earlier she might have lived, that they were very sorry. 5 minutes. Her mother died for 5 minutes. Because in those 11 minutes, not a single car out of dozens that drove past stopped for a 19-year-old girl screaming in the road beside an overturned car. The film ended. Elise stood on a Brooklyn sidewalk at 27, 20 steps away from an old man on his knees calling a name, and 3 young men standing over him with the look Elise knew too well, the look of the strong staring down at the weak, the look of people who knew no one was going to stop them. The first voice in Elise's head said, "You're not a hero. You're just an orphan nobody needs. Keep walking." But the second voice, the voice that didn't speak in words but in the image of headlights sweeping over her face and moving on, said only one thing, and that one thing burned through every hesitation in Elise's body like gasoline meeting flame. No one stopped. No one stopped for your mother. And now you're going to not stop for him too. Elise stepped forward. Not fast, not running, but steady and decisive. The walk of someone who'd already made her choice and had nothing left to weigh. She slid the earbud into her pocket. 20 steps became 15. 15 became 10. She could see more clearly now. The old man was still on his knees, still reaching toward the watch on the pavement. The glass cracked, and she heard him whisper. So softly it was almost nothing. "Margaret." Trey stood over him, bending down, reaching for the watch. Shane was on the left. Dustin was behind. None of the 3 saw Elise. None of them heard her coming. Not until she stopped less than 5 steps away and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and in the emptiness of that street it cut through the air like a knife. "Let him go." Trey turned. The movement was slow, the slow of someone who couldn't quite believe a stranger had dared to interrupt him mid-street. He looked Elise up and down, a thin girl in a faded gray hoodie, hair tied in a ponytail, an old backpack slung over one shoulder, worn-heeled shoes, and eyes locked on him without blinking. He looked at her the way you look at a stray cat that's just leapt into the road to block a truck, half amused, half confused. "Go home, sweetheart," Trey said, his voice still calm, even lightly, the kind of false gentleness that gives someone one last chance before things get complicated. "It's late. This doesn't involve you. Go." Elise didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She stood there 5 steps from Trey and said it again. The same sentence, the same tone, no louder and no softer. "I said let him go." Shane, on Trey's left, glanced at Trey and then back at Elise. His half-smile turned into a sneer. He walked toward Elise, 2 steps, 3, and stopped right in front of her. So close she could smell cheap beer on his breath. He was nearly a head taller, and he used that height to look down at her with the expression he thought would scare her. Elise didn't move back. 2 years with a man who hit her had taught her that backing away only made them come closer. 2 years of Krav Maga had taught her that standing still didn't mean being powerless. She looked at Shane, straight into his eyes, and she saw what she'd seen too many times, the hollow confidence of someone who'd never met a person willing to hit back. Behind Elise, Arthur was still on his knees, his hands still reaching toward the cracked watch, and he began to try to push himself up. Knees shaking, palms braced on the sidewalk, Trey saw Arthur move, slipped past Shane, reached the old man, and shoved him down again. Harder this time. Both of Arthur's knees slammed into the concrete. Then his hands caught him, a groan leaking from his mouth, painful and weak, and Elise heard skin scrape on rough stone. That was the moment Elise stopped thinking. Not because fear shut her mind down, but because her body had been trained to respond when her thoughts couldn't move fast enough. 2 years of Krav Maga hadn't turned her into a fighter. It had taught her something simpler and more real. When you're attacked, don't wait, don't ask, don't beg, act. Shane was still in front of her, and when he lifted his right hand, maybe to shove her, maybe to grab her shoulder, she didn't wait to find out. She shifted left, fast and clean. One sharp step, then her right hand snapped onto Shane's raised wrist, her fingers locking tight as she twisted his wrist outward, at the exact angle her Krav Maga instructor had drilled into her hundreds of times, until it became reflex. Shane's wrist turned, his elbow locked, his balance broke, and before he even understood what was happening, Elise used his own momentum to drive him aside. Shane pitched sideways, his feet tangling, and his shoulder slammed into a metal trash can at the curb with a crash that echoed down the block. The can toppled, the lid popped off, and garbage spilled over him. Dustin reacted on instinct. He lunged from behind, his hand reaching for Elise's shoulder, but she'd already turned, and when Dustin came close enough, she kicked straight into his knee. Not a pretty sweeping kick like in the movies. A short, direct strike, knee to knee, precise into the outside of his joint. Dustin cried out, his leg folding sideways, and he dropped to the sidewalk, both hands clutching his knee, face twisted. Trey stared at Shane in the trash, stared at Dustin on the ground holding his leg. Then he looked at Elise, the 55-kilogram girl in the old hoodie, her ponytail loosening, standing between the old man and his two friends, breathing fast but with steady hands. Trey was the biggest one, taller than her by at least 20 centimeters, heavier by at least 30 kilograms. He rushed her, faster than she expected. The first punch came with his right hand. Elise leaned left, his fist slicing past her ear, the air roaring, close enough to graze. The second punch switched hands, left this time, and Elise couldn't get all the way out of it. Trey's knuckles hit her right shoulder, right where collarbone met muscle, and pain exploded like a hot nail driven into her bone. Elise stumbled back 2 steps, nearly tripping. But she didn't fall. She didn't fall. And in the instant Trey thought she would, in the instant he tipped forward with the follow-through of his own punch, Elise rotated her body, drove all the weight of her 55-kilogram frame into her right elbow, and struck upward. Her elbow cracked into Trey's face, straight into his nose. Not her hardest hit, but the nose was the most sensitive point on a man's face, and an elbow was harder than a fist. Blood sprayed. Trey reeled back 3 steps, one hand clamped over his nose, blood pouring between his fingers, dark red under the yellow streetlight. He stared at the blood on his hand, then at Elise, and in his eyes there was no more contempt, no more amusement, only something he wasn't used to feeling at all. Shock. "You crazy bitch," he said, his voice thick with blood, warped, trembling, half rage and half disbelief at what had just happened. Elise stepped back once, not out of fear, but to place herself between Arthur and the 3 men. She stood there, her right shoulder throbbing from Trey's punch, her left hand scraped raw from grabbing Shane's wrist, her breathing fast, her chest rising and falling, but her feet planted on the sidewalk and her eyes fixed forward without blinking. Behind her, Arthur was still on his knees, both arms wrapped around the cracked watch pressed to his chest, trembling. In front of her, Trey stood 3 steps away, one hand clamped over his nose, blood seeping between his fingers. Shane was hauling himself up out of the trash, his sleeve stuck with can tabs and dirty paper, his face red more from humiliation than pain. Dustin was still down on one knee, both hands gripping his leg, his expression twisted. Elise looked at them one by one, and then she spoke. Her voice still wasn't loud, but every word was so clear that in the emptiness of that street, it felt carved into the air. "Look at him. Look at his feet. He's wearing house slippers. He came out at midnight in house slippers. He doesn't know where he is. He's calling the name of a woman who might not even be alive anymore. He's sick. Can't you see that?" No one answered. It was the kind of silence heavier than any scream, the kind of silence all 3 of them could hear, but none of them wanted to admit they were hearing. Shane stood still, can tab still clinging to his sleeve, the half-smile long gone. Dustin kept his head down, not looking at Elise, not looking at Arthur, only staring at his hurting knee. And Trey stood there with his hand over his nose, blood still leaking slowly through the gaps in his fingers, watching Elise with something more complicated than anger. He looked down at Arthur, the old man clutching the cracked watch to his chest like he was holding a child, his mouth still murmuring Margaret. And maybe in that moment, the briefest moment, Trey saw what Elise had just said. The house slippers, the misbuttoned shirt, the lost eyes. But if he saw it, he didn't let it stay. He spat blood onto the sidewalk, a dark red stain on gray concrete, and turned away. "The old man isn't worth it," he said to Shane and Dustin, or maybe to himself. "Let's go." Shane followed immediately, fast, without looking back. Dustin forced himself up, still limping, and dragged himself after them. But Trey, before he fully walked off, looked back at Elise. His eyes weren't shocked anymore. They weren't angry. They were cold, the cold of someone memorizing. "I'll remember your face," he said, then turned away. and the three shadows disappeared down the block, dissolving into darkness, their footsteps fading until the street held only two people again. Elise stood there for a few more seconds, eyes still on the direction they'd gone, making sure they were truly gone. Only then did her body allow her to feel the pain. Her right shoulder burned, deep in the bone instead of on the skin. Her left hand stung, scraped open, a thin line of blood seeping into her palm. Her knees trembled a little, maybe because the adrenaline was draining out. She drew in one long, slow breath, and then she turned back to Arthur. He was still on his knees, clutching the watch, looking up at her with wide, bewildered eyes. Elise knelt beside him gently, the way you kneel beside a lost child. She opened her backpack and pulled out the apron she always rolled up and stuffed away after every shift. She tore a long strip from the hem, folded it, and wrapped it around Arthur's right knee, where the skin was scraped and blood was seeping, mixing with dirt. She tied it carefully. Not too tight, not too loose. Then she unzipped her hoodie, pulled it off, and draped it over Arthur's shoulders. The night was cold, and she knew she'd be cold in her thin t-shirt, but the old man was shaking, and he needed it more than she did. Arthur looked up at her. His eyes were wet, not from pain, but from something deeper than pain, something tied to a memory his illness still couldn't reach. He stared at her face under the streetlight and said, his voice trembling but so gentle, Elise had to bite her lip to hold herself together. "Are you Margaret?" Elise pressed her lips together. Her eyes burned, hot, but she didn't cry. She was used to not crying. She took Arthur's hand, lightly, and said, "No, sir, I'm not Margaret. I'm Elise. I'm going to help you get home." Arthur didn't understand every word, but he felt the voice, the warmth inside it, and he squeezed her hand back, weakly but with trust. Elise looked down at the watch Arthur still held in his other hand, the glass split by a crack running across it, but the hand still moving. She gently took the watch from him, used the hem of her t-shirt to wipe away the dirt and blood on the gold edge, then slipped it back onto Arthur's left wrist and fastened the clasp carefully. Arthur looked at the watch on his wrist, traced the cracked face with a fingertip, and smiled. A small smile, sad, but still a smile. Elise checked the pockets of Arthur's shirt, searching for anything that could tell her who he was. In the left breast pocket, she found a small folded note, written in blue ink in neat handwriting. "Arthur Maddox. If you find him, please call this number." Beneath it was a string of digits. Someone had prepared the note and tucked it into his pocket for exactly this situation, because they knew that one day he would wander off and not know the way home. Elise took out her phone and dialed. It rang. Once, twice, then someone answered. But the story didn't end on that Brooklyn sidewalk that night. Because the person Elise had just called, the person who picked up on the other end, wasn't an ordinary man. 15 miles away, at the top of a penthouse in Manhattan, Cale Maddox sat at the head of a long black oak table, and no one in the room dared to look him in the eye. He was 36, black hair combed back, a jawline sharp as if it had been carved with a blade, wearing a black suit without a tie, the top 2 buttons open, the kind of man who didn't have to try to look dangerous, because his presence alone was the warning. In front of him sat 6 men along both sides of the table, each in an expensive suit or shirt, each one a link in the network Cale ran, and each of them understood that an 11 o'clock at night, meeting like this, was not the kind you could excuse yourself from early. The deal on the table was worth millions of dollars, tied to a shipment that needed to move through the port next week, and Cale was listening to the man across from him lay out the numbers, but the way Cale listened made the speaker sweat more than it reassured him. Cale never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He was the kind of man who, when he spoke, the whole room went quiet, not because he was loud, but because everyone knew the cost of not listening. He asked a question, short, in a low, even tone, and the man across from him stumbled over his words, searching for the answer. Cale hadn't even heard the full reply when the meeting room door opened. Brennan walked in, 34, broad-shouldered, hair cut close to the scalp, in a gray suit. He was the only person allowed to open that door without knocking. Brennan had been with Cale since Cale was 28, 8 years through everything, and Cale trusted Brennan with a kind of trust he gave no one else except his father. But tonight, when Brennan entered, the first thing Cale saw wasn't his loyal security man, it was Brennan's face. And Cale knew. He knew before Brennan spoke, because Brennan was a man who never let emotion touch his expression unless it involved one person. "Boss," Brennan said, low but clear enough for the whole room to hear. "Mrs. Daly just called. Mr. Arthur is gone." Cale stood, not slowly, but as if someone had yanked him upright by a wire. His chair slid back and struck the glass wall behind him. The 6 men around the table fell silent. The one presenting the numbers stopped mid-sentence. Pen still raised, mouth still open. No one asked a question. No one needed to, because this was the first time every person in that room had seen the steel mask of Cale Maddox crack. Not in anger, in fear. The kind of fear only a man about to lose the most important thing in his life can feel. Cale was an only child. Margaret, his mother, had died 4 years earlier from late-stage lung cancer. They caught it too late. Chemotherapy didn't work, and she passed in a hospital room with Cale holding one hand and Arthur holding the other. The day Margaret died, Arthur didn't cry. He sat by her bed, holding her hand until it went cold. Then he stood, went home, sat in the chair by the living room window, and didn't speak for 3 days. After that, Arthur began to forget. At first it was small things, forgetting to turn off the stove, forgetting to lock the door, forgetting the housekeeper's name. Then it became larger things, forgetting dates, forgetting the way home, forgetting his son's name. The doctor told Cale it was Alzheimer's. Early stage, it would progress. There was no cure, only ways to slow it. Cale hired a private nurse, hired caregivers, installed security cameras throughout the house, bought everything money could buy. But there were things money couldn't buy, and memory was one of them. And Cale knew that with every day that passed, his father was slowly disappearing from his own life. And the thing Cale feared most, more than enemies, more than prison, more than death, was the day Arthur would look at him and not know who he was. Now Arthur was gone. Out on the street, at night, alone. The mafia boss who made half the city afraid stood in the middle of the meeting room, and he wasn't thinking about the $1 million deal. He wasn't thinking about the shipment. He wasn't thinking about anything except a 72-year-old man in house slippers out in the world at midnight, not even sure who he was. Cale looked at Brennan. Mobilize everyone. Cameras, cars, everything. Find him. Brennan nodded, turned away, pulled out his phone. The 6 men at the table exchanged glances. One of them started to ask about the meeting, but the man beside him gave a slight shake of his head, and the whole room understood the meeting was over. Cale stood by the window, looking down at the city, millions of lights burning below, and his father was somewhere inside that sea of lights, alone, lost, maybe afraid, maybe calling Margaret's name, maybe in danger. With every minute that passed, Cale's grip tightened, his knuckles bleaching white, his jaw locked. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Brennan returned with updates. The cameras had found nothing yet. People were spreading out to search. Mrs. Daly was crying on the phone. 15 minutes. 20 minutes. Then Cale's phone vibrated. An unknown number. He answered and heard a young woman's voice, her breath not fully steady, as if she'd just been through something. Her body was still shaking off. "Hello. I found a note in the pocket of an elderly man named Arthur Maddox. He's in Brooklyn, on Fulton near the corner of Nostrand. His knees are scraped. It's not serious. I'm sitting with him." Cale gripped the phone so hard he heard the plastic creak. Did he say anything? He's been calling for Margaret. Cale closed his eyes for 1 second. Only one. Then opened them. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He hung up, turned to Brennan. "Brooklyn, Fulton near Nostrand. Move. Now." They stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, and in that small space, under the cold white light, Brennan saw something he'd never seen in 8 years at Cale's side. Cale's hand was shaking, slightly, almost invisible unless you looked closely. But Brennan looked closely, because that was his job, and he saw it. The hand that signed $1-million contracts without hesitation. The hand that made decisions that ruined other men without a tremor. That hand was shaking, because his father was out on the street alone at midnight, in house slippers, calling the name of a woman who had been dead for 4 years. Brennan said nothing. He only pressed the button for the basement, where the car was waiting, and stood silent beside Cale as the elevator descended. The black car turned onto Fulton Street close to midnight, smooth as a shadow sliding over the pavement. Brennan was in the driver's seat, his eyes sweeping both sides of the block before the car fully stopped, an 8-year habit he never dropped, always checking the surroundings before letting Cale step out. The street was quiet. A few storefronts were shut behind metal gates. A stray cat darted across the road. No sign of danger. Brennan gave a small nod. Cale opened the door and got out. He saw them immediately. Under the weak yellow streetlight, on the dirty sidewalk tight against the wall of a closed shop, a young woman was sitting on the ground beside his father. Arthur lay on his side, his knees resting on the girl's old, frayed backpack as a pillow. Eyes closed, mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. Draped over his shoulders was a faded gray hoodie, clearly not his, too small for his body, but someone had pulled it up to his throat, covering his shoulders and chest. His right knee was wrapped with a strip of white cloth torn from something, neatly tied, a faint pink stain soaking through, and the girl beside him, her left hand resting lightly on Arthur's arm as if keeping watch even while he slept, wore only a thin white t-shirt in the cold Brooklyn night. She wasn't shivering, or she was trying not to. Cale walked closer, and with each step he saw another detail. Her backpack serving as his father's pillow, her hoodie warming his father's knee bandaged with something torn from her own things. She sat on a cold sidewalk in a thin shirt, caring for an elderly man she'd never met, in the middle of the night, in a neighborhood that wasn't the safest in the city. Cale knelt beside his father. He set a hand on Arthur's forehead, gentle, then brushed a few messy white strands aside. Arthur opened his eyes, blinking, and looked up. Cale. Arthur's voice was hoarse, weak, but his eyes brightened with recognition. "You're here. I was looking for your mother's bakery. I couldn't find it." "I know, Dad," Cale said, so softly Brennan, standing 3 steps away, could barely hear. That voice wasn't the one he'd used in the meeting room hours earlier, not the voice that had kept 6 powerful men silent, afraid to breathe too loud. That voice was a son's voice. "I'm taking you home." Arthur nodded, faintly, then closed his eyes again, settled because his son had come. Cale stood, and for the first time, he looked at Elise. Really looked. Not a quick glance, not a fast assessment, but a careful look, the kind of attention Cale gave very few people, because he wasn't in the habit of caring about anyone except his father. She was thin. That was the first thing he noticed. Not thin the way people were when they chose to diet, but thin the way people were when they didn't have enough to eat. Her collarbones stood out under the thin shirt. Her wrists were small, but her palms were calloused, the hands of someone who worked with her body. Her right shoulder carried a bruise spreading beneath the sleeve, fresh and dark, clearly from a punch taken in the last few hours. Her left palm was scraped, a faint smear of blood already drying. Her ponytail had loosened, a few strands stuck to her forehead, and her eyes. Those eyes lifted to his without flinching, without pleading, without being impressed by the black car or the suit or anything that radiated from him. The eyes of someone who'd faced too much and no longer had the energy to pretend to be fragile. "You're the one who called me," Cale said. Not a question. Elise nodded. "Yes, I found the note in his shirt pocket." Brennan had stepped up beside Cale, and he leaned in to speak low, only for Cale to hear. "Boss, the security camera from the shop across the street caught it. I just checked. She took on 3 guys. Alone." Cale lifted one eyebrow. It was the only reaction he showed. But to Brennan, who could read Cale as easily as breathing, a single raised brow meant he was genuinely surprised. Cale looked again at the bruise on Elise's shoulder, at her scraped hand, at her small frame, then at his father lying peacefully under her hoodie, and he understood the injuries on her body were because of his father. "You're hurt," he said, looking at her shoulder. "Let me take you to the hospital." "No," Elise said, calm, as if the bruise were nothing. "It's not serious." Cale studied her for a second, then tried again. "Let me take you home. At least that." Elise hesitated, and Cale saw the hesitation clearly. Not hesitation from thinking, but hesitation from caution. Her eyes flicked to the black car, to Brennan, to Cale, then back to Cale. It was a look Cale recognized, the look of someone who'd been used before, the look of someone who'd learned the hard way not to get into a stranger's car at night, especially not a stranger who was a man. Cale understood, and he didn't push. He pulled a small business card from the inside pocket of his jacket, white, only a name and a phone number, no title, no company, no address. He offered it to Elise. "At least tell me your name. I owe you. Elise. Elise Whitmore. And you don't owe me anything. Anyone would have done it." Cale looked at her. looked at the thin girl in the white t-shirt, who had just fought 3 men bigger than her, taken off her hoodie for a stranger, sat watch on a cold sidewalk in the middle of a Brooklyn night, and said anyone would have done it. "No," he said, low and slow, each word carrying weight. "Not everyone would have done it." Elise took the card, glanced at it for a second, then slipped it into her back pocket. She stood, wincing a little as her right shoulder flared, then swung her backpack onto her left shoulder. Brennan had gently helped Arthur up and guided him to the car. Arthur lowered himself into the back seat, the faded gray hoodie still around his shoulders, and as Brennan was about to close the door, Arthur turned his head, searching, and said, his voice trembling but clear, "Margaret, that girl, I want to thank her." Cale stood by the car and heard his father speak, then turned back toward Elise. She had already started walking away, her back to him, the thin white t-shirt fragile in the cold Brooklyn night, her backpack slung on one shoulder, her steps steady but slightly tilted to the left because her right shoulder hurt. She didn't look back. She moved into the darkness at the end of the block, smaller, dimmer, until she disappeared completely. On his father's shoulders, Elise's faded gray hoodie was still there, warmer than anything expensive Cale had ever bought for his father. Cale turned to Brennan and said, his voice calm but carrying something Brennan had never heard in 8 years at his side, "Find out about her. Everything." The next morning, Brennan placed a brown folder on Cale's desk. He didn't say a word. He just set it down and then stepped back 2 paces, waiting. Cale sat behind the desk, his black coffee untouched, dark circles under his eyes because he'd barely slept the night before. He'd stayed beside Arthur's bed until nearly 4 a.m, watching until his father slept soundly, listening to him murmur Margaret's name in his dreams, then fall silent, then murmur again. Cale didn't open the folder from the first page. He didn't read the file, didn't look through the papers, didn't study the printed lines Brennan had spent all night gathering. Instead, he pulled out a small USB drive, plugged it into his laptop, and opened the video file. Security footage from the used electronics shop across the street from where Arthur had been attacked. The quality wasn't good. Black and white, slightly blurred, a top-down angle, but it was clear enough to see everything. The clip was 47 seconds long. Cale pressed play. Second 1 through second 3. A small girl appeared at the edge of the frame and walked toward the 3 young men standing around Arthur. Second 4. She stopped, said something the camera couldn't capture because there was no sound. Second 7. One of the 3 stepped toward her and stood right in her face. She didn't move back. Second 12. The biggest one shoved Arthur down, the old man's knees hitting the ground. Second 13. The girl moved, and from second 13 to second 35, Cale watched a thin girl in an old hoodie put herself between his father and 3 men twice her size. She grabbed one man's wrist, twisted, and drove him into a trash can. She kicked the second man's knee, and he dropped. She took a punch to the shoulder from the third, staggered, almost fell, but didn't, then drove her elbow into his face, and blood sprayed. 47 seconds. Small, but she didn't give up a single step. Cale watched the clip to the end, then rewound. Not to the fight, to what came after. The part the camera caught once the 3 men walked away. The part where the girl knelt beside Arthur, tore her apron to wrap his knee, then unzipped her hoodie, pulled it off, and draped it over his shoulders. Cale stared at that moment on the screen. The girl had just been punched, her shoulder already bruising, her hand scraped open, in the cold night, and she took off the only jacket she had to cover an old man she'd never met. He rewound again, watched it again, her hands lifting the hoodie over Arthur's shoulders, pulling it up to his throat, covering him, careful. Then she sat beside him in her thin t-shirt and rested her hand on his arm. Cale paused the video. The screen froze on the image of the girl sitting beside his father on the sidewalk, and he stared at it longer than he stared at anything else that day. Brennan stood still and waited. Then he spoke, his tone flat, brief, summing up Elise Whitmore's file in 3 sentences. Her mother died in a car accident 8 years ago. No one stopped to help for 11 minutes. The doctor said 5 minutes earlier might have saved her. Her father left when she was little. No relatives. No one. 2 jobs, minimum wage, 2 months behind on rent, about to be evicted. Cale said nothing for a long time. He sat there, staring at the dark laptop screen, staring at the empty space in front of him, and in his mind, everything slid into its place. The girl who stopped on that sidewalk that night didn't stop because she was brave. She didn't stop because she wanted to be a hero. She stopped because 8 years ago, her mother lay in an overturned car, and no one stopped for her. 11 minutes. No one stopped. And the 19-year-old girl who had stood on the highway screaming had sworn to herself, maybe not in words, but in the scar on her wrist, that if she ever saw someone who needed help, she would stop, even if she was tired, even if she was afraid, even if no one else stopped. She stopped because of her mother. She stopped because of her mother, Cale said softly, almost to himself, and he understood that more deeply than most people ever could, because he would have done anything for his mother if he'd been given the chance. But he didn't have that chance anymore. Margaret was gone. And every day, Arthur was slipping away too. Brennan spoke again, practical, returning to the work. "Those 3 guys last night want me to handle it." Cale looked at the screen, tapped a key. The video came back, and he scrubbed to the moment the biggest one shoved Arthur down, then stopped. Trey's face was clear on the screen, the shaved sides of his hair, black hoodie, bending over Cale's father on the ground. Cale stared at that face. "Find them," he said. Brennan found them in less than 24 hours. With the network Cale ran, finding 3 street kids in Brooklyn wasn't any harder than finding an address on a map. Security cameras gave a face gave a name gave an address, and an address gave habits. Trey Marshall, 24, lived in a month-to-month studio on Atlantic Avenue. Shane Weber, 23, shared a cramped place in a cheap building near Prospect Park. Dustin Hale, 22, still lived with his mother in Bedford-Stuyvesant. None of the 3 had serious felonies, just a few arrests for small-time things, pickpocketing, disorderly conduct, the kind of charges New York police handled by holding you overnight and letting you go. But last night they'd picked the wrong man to mess with. On Friday night, Brennan learned all 3 had a habit of gathering at a cheap pool hall on Flatbush, the kind of place where the neon flickered, the felt on the tables was worn thin, beer was sold by the can, and nobody asked what you came here to do. Brennan arrived at 9 o'clock at night, not alone. 2 men came with him, both in black suits, both big, both silent from the moment they stepped out of the car to the moment they walked into the hall. The door opened, the 3 of them entered, and the pool hall went quiet. Not quiet because people were curious, but quiet because people instinctively knew the men who'd just walked in didn't belong here, and the reason they were here wasn't to play pool. Trey was at the far table, cue in hand. Shane sat on a tall stool beside him holding a can of beer. Dustin leaned against the wall nearby. All 3 looked up when the door opened, and the grin on Shane's face died instantly. Brennan walked straight to their table, the 2 men in black suits, stopping a few steps to either side, not blocking the way outright, but not leaving any exit that looked easy. Brennan didn't bother with an introduction. He set one thing on the green felt, and only one thing. A gold watch, its face split by a crack running across the glass. The rim scuffed, but the hands still moving. Trey stared at it. His face went pale. He recognized it. Of course he did. Only last night he'd yanked it from an old man's wrist on a Brooklyn sidewalk. And only last night a girl had made his nose bleed for it. The cue stick lowered in Trey's hand until it touched the table, the soft tap of wood on felt sounding too loud in the silence. Brennan looked at Trey, then at Shane, then at Dustin, slowly, one by one, making sure all 3 were listening. Then he spoke. His voice was even, not loud, not quiet, not threatening, and it didn't need to be, because every word carried the weight of something they all understood couldn't be negotiated. "The old man you shoved down last night on Fulton, the old man you tried to take a watch from, the old man in house slippers calling his wife's name in the middle of the night, is my boss's father." Trey opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Shane set his beer down, his hand shaking, foam spilling over the rim. Dustin stayed pressed to the wall, and if that wall could have opened, he would have slipped through it, Brennan continued, the same steady tone. "I didn't come here to hear explanations. I came to deliver a message. Leave the city. Tonight." Trey swallowed, his throat bobbing once and then again. "We didn't know," he said, his voice rough, higher than usual, every trace of last night's swagger gone. "We really didn't know who he was." Brennan didn't answer the apology. He looked at Trey, stayed silent for a moment, then added one more sentence, and that sentence hit Trey harder than any fist. "There was a girl, half your size, who stood between you and that old man last night. She got hit. She got bruised. She bled. And she didn't run. You did. Think about that while you pack. Brennan lifted the watch off the table, careful, and turned away. The two men in black suits followed. The door shut behind them, and the three young men stood there in the cheap pool hall, beer still foaming, cue still chalked, and none of them could find a single word for a long time. Brennan returned to the penthouse at 10 o'clock at night and set the watch on Cale's desk. Cale picked it up, turned it over, and looked at the 4 engraved words on the gold back, dulled slightly by time but still clear. M and A, forever. Margaret and Arthur, forever. He sat there staring at the inscription, his thumb moving slowly over the metal. Over the place Margaret's finger had touched when she had it engraved 46 years earlier, the place Arthur's finger traced every day like a talisman. Then Cale opened the desk drawer and laid the watch inside, gently, carefully, as if he were placing something more fragile than the cracked glass. Because it wasn't just a watch, it was the most precious thing Arthur still had left from Margaret, and Cale wasn't going to let anyone touch it again. 2 days later, Cale Maddox walked into Pauline's bar at 8 o'clock in the evening, and he looked as out of place as a Rolls-Royce parked in a scrapyard. A black suit, tailored to perfection, the kind where you could tell from the stitching on the shoulder alone that it cost more than a full year of rent for anyone in that room. Polished black leather shoes, so clean they reflected the flickering neon lights on the ceiling. Black hair slicked back, a sharp jawline, and eyes that swept the bar with the kind of gaze Pauline recognized instantly, the gaze of someone used to owning every room he walked into. Pauline stood behind the counter, one hand still pouring beer from the tap, and she didn't turn it off, didn't stop pouring, but her eyes stayed fixed on the man who'd just walked in and didn't leave him until he sat down. He took a seat at the far end of the bar, the closest spot to where Elise was working, and he sat with easy, unforced grace, as if he came here every night. But he didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. Jo was near the kitchen, carrying a tray of glasses, and when she spotted Cale, her eyes widened, the tray tilted, 2 glasses sliding together with a sharp clink. She looked at Elise with a question written plainly on her face. "Who's that?" Elise didn't need Jo to ask. She'd seen him the moment he walked through the door. She recognized him immediately, even though she'd only met him once, in the middle of the night, on a sidewalk, when she'd been so exhausted she could barely remember anything, but she remembered those eyes. Eyes that had looked at her as if trying to understand who she was, not to judge, but to register. Elise walked over, a bar towel still draped over her shoulder, apron stained with beer, hair tied back in a ponytail with a few strands stuck to her forehead after 2 hours on shift. She stopped across the bar from him and said, her voice calm, neither surprised nor impressed, "You found me fast." Cale looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't pretend to be relaxed. He didn't try to soften the moment. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope, setting it on the bar between them. "This is 6 months of your rent." Elise looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She looked at it the way she'd learned to look at traps, the kind that looked like kindness but always came with a price. Then she pushed the envelope back toward Cale with 2 fingers, gently, as if moving something that didn't belong to her. "I don't take money for doing what's right." Cale didn't take the envelope back. He left it there, between them, on the bar, and spoke again. His voice lower, slower, every word carrying weight Elise felt even though she didn't want to. "My father is the only thing I have left in this world. He's 72. He's sick. He went out into the street at midnight because he thought his wife was waiting for him at a bakery. And if you hadn't been there, I don't know where I would have found him this morning, or in what condition. That money isn't enough for that." Elise stayed still. She looked at Cale and saw something she hadn't expected to see in a man in an expensive suit in a cheap bar. Truth, not the polished kind, but raw and fragile. The kind only people talking about what matters most to them ever let slip. She pressed her lips together and then spoke more quietly, as if the words weren't meant for the bar but for the small space between them. "He called me Margaret." Cale didn't answer right away. He went silent, and Elise saw his jaw tighten for a second before he let it go. "Margaret was my mother. She died 4 years ago." Silence followed. Not an awkward silence, but a heavy one, the kind where both people were holding something too large to say out loud. Elise knew what it meant to lose a mother. She knew it better than most people ever would. And looking at Cale then, hearing him say those 4 words, "She died 4 years ago," in a voice he tried to keep steady but couldn't quite manage, she understood that the man sitting across from her, no matter who he was, no matter what he did, no matter how much his suit cost, was just a son who'd lost his mother. Just like her. Cale stood up. He didn't take the envelope back, but he didn't force Elise to take it either. He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket, identical to the one he'd given her on the Brooklyn sidewalk, and placed it on the bar beside the envelope. "If you change your mind, anytime." Then he turned and walked out, the heavy wooden door closing behind him. The bar filled again with music, clinking glasses, laughter, as if nothing had happened. Pauline walked over to Elise, eyes flicking toward the door and then down to the white envelope and the card on the counter. "Who was that?" Elise looked at the card. Just a name and a phone number. No title, no company. "I don't know," she said. Then she picked up the card, looked at it for another second, and slid it into her back pocket. The envelope she nudged gently toward Pauline and shook her head. Pauline looked at Elise, looked at the envelope, wanted to say something, but she knew Elise. She knew that look, the look of someone who'd decided and didn't want to argue. She took the envelope and put it in the drawer under the bar, just in case Elise changed her mind. Elise went back to wiping glasses, but her hands moved more slowly than usual, and every so often, she reached behind her, touching the back pocket where the business card rested. She didn't throw it away. The next day, in the middle of her shift, Joe pulled Elise into a shadowed corner behind the bar, eyes wide, phone held up in front of Elise, the screen glowing, and whispered in a rushed voice, "I googled the name on your card." Elise looked at the screen. Joe had typed Cale Maddox into the search bar, and not much came up. Not the kind of flood you got for a celebrity, but the kind of scarcity you got from someone who worked hard to leave no trace. And still, what was there was enough. An article from the New York Post 3 years earlier, a headline mentioning the Maddox family and ties to organized crime. Another piece from a local news site with a photo of Cale walking out of federal court in a black suit, expressionless, an attorney at his side, the headline reading "Acquitted for lack of evidence." A long blog post listing the underground power families of New York, the Maddox name on the list, surrounded by the same repeated phrases. Organized crime, alleged, underworld, under investigation. Joe scrolled down with her finger, and more results appeared, each one painting the same picture. Then Joe looked up at Elise, her eyes still round, her whisper sharp. "Elise, the man who came in last night, the man in the black suit who left you that envelope of money, that man is mafia." Elise didn't speak. She stared at Joe's phone, at the photo of Cale outside the courthouse, the face in the picture identical to the face that had sat across from her at the bar, the face that had said, "My father is the only thing I have left in this world," in a voice she had almost believed was real. Almost. Her heart sped up, but not from fear. Elise was too used to fear for it to be the thing that made her heart race. Her heart was racing because she hated the feeling creeping into her chest right now, the feeling of having almost trusted a stranger, of having almost let herself soften in front of a man whose eyes she didn't understand, of having almost thought maybe not everyone wanted to use her. She hated that feeling because the last time she'd had it, the last time she'd looked into a stranger's eyes and thought he was good, she'd paid for it with 2 years. 2 years living in an apartment whose door locked from the outside. 2 years learning to guess whether he would hit with his left hand or his right. 2 years before, she found the courage to run in the middle of the night with one bag of clothes and a body full of bruises. After those 2 years, she'd sworn she would never trust a stranger just because he said the right things. And Cale Maddox, no matter how real his voice had sounded when he spoke about his father, no matter how wet his eyes had been when he said Margaret's name, was still a stranger she now knew was mafia. Elise took the business card from her back pocket and looked at it one last time, the name and phone number on clean white paper. Then she opened her backpack and pushed the card down to the bottom, beneath her spare shirt and the can of pepper spray she always carried. She didn't throw it away. She didn't know why she didn't. Maybe because Cale's voice when he said Margaret was my mother. She died 4 years ago sounded exactly like her own voice when she talked about her mother. Maybe because she'd noticed his hand placing that card on the bar with hands that, by instinct, she could tell were trying not to shake. But she didn't call. She zipped her backpack shut, went back to the bar, and finished her shift as if nothing had happened. Joe watched her, wanting to say more, but Elise shook her head once, small and final, and Joe understood the conversation was over. But life didn't give Elise many choices, and 2 weeks later, everything collapsed. 2 weeks later, On a Tuesday, Elise went to her morning shift at the hotel like she always did, and when she came back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the lock on her studio had been changed. She stood in front of the door, her old key still in her hand, tried turning it once, twice, 3 times, but it wouldn't go in. She looked down at the base of the door, and there, 2 large black trash bags were tied tight and leaned against the wall. Inside was everything she owned. Clothes, a few books, the pillow she'd had since college, the photo of her at 6 years old on her mother's lap, tucked between 2 shirts so it wouldn't crease. Elise Whitmore's whole life, 27 years of it, packed into 2 black trash bags. She didn't knock. She didn't call the landlord. She knew no one would answer. And if someone did, the answer would be the same. 2 months of rent. The deadline passed. No exceptions. She bent down, lifted the bags, 1 in each hand, and walked down the stairs. That same week, the hotel manager called her into the office and said they had to cut hours. The economy was tight. Staff reductions. She was going from 5 shifts a week to 3 starting next week. Elise sat there, listened, nodded, said thank you, and walked out. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry when she needed to a long time ago. That night, she still went to her bar shift, because she didn't know what else to do. Because if she stopped moving, she would have to think, and if she thought, she would have to face the fact that she had no home to go back to. Pauline watched her more closely than usual, but didn't ask, because Pauline knew when to ask and when to leave Elise alone. Joe did ask, in a low voice behind the bar, "Are you okay? Where are you sleeping tonight?" Elise said she'd figure it out. Joe offered to let her stay, then stopped mid-sentence because both of them knew Joe's apartment was already shared with 3 other people, the floor already covered in mattresses, no room left for another body, even a body that weighed less than 55 kilograms. The shift ended at 11. Elise walked out of the bar, lifted the 2 black trash bags she'd kept under a chair during the shift, 1 in each hand, and stepped into the street. It was raining. Not heavy rain, but a thin, cold drizzle, the kind that soaked into your clothes slowly until you were drenched without realizing when it began. She walked to the nearest bus stop, the kind with a clear plastic roof, sat on the bench, placed the 2 trash bags on either side of her feet, and stared out at the street. Rain ran down her face, from her forehead to her cheeks, to her chin, dripping onto her hands, and she couldn't tell whether it was rain or tears. Maybe it was both. Maybe she was finally crying, for the first time in a long time, but the rain was thick enough to hide it, and she was stubborn enough not to admit it. She sat there at midnight under the bus stop roof in Brooklyn, holding 2 trash bags that contained her whole life. And she thought, I'm 27. I don't have a home. I don't have family. I don't have anyone. And next week I'm losing 2 more shifts. Her hand moved without thinking to the bottom of her backpack, searching for something she didn't want to admit she was searching for. And her fingertips touched a small piece of paper, wet but still intact. She pulled it out, the white business card, the ink slightly smudged from rain seeping through the fabric of her bag, but the name and number still readable. K.L. Maddox. She stared at the card under the streetlight filtering through the plastic roof of the bus stop, and in her mind, the battle began. He's mafia. That was the first thought, clear and sharp. In Joe's voice back in the bar with the phone held up. Organized crime. Alleged. Underworld. But then she remembered something else. She remembered his hand shaking in the elevator because his father was missing. She remembered his voice saying, "I'm taking you home," in the softest tone she'd ever heard from a man. She remembered him standing by the bar door, looking at her, and saying no. Not everyone would do that. With eyes she hadn't been able to find deceit in, no matter how hard she'd searched. He hadn't looked at her like prey, not like something to use and throw away. He'd looked at her like a person. She sat in the rain with the wet business card in her hand and thought there was a thin line between being strong and being stupid. Being strong meant getting up on your own. Being stupid meant refusing the hand reaching for you when you were drowning. And tonight, sitting at a bus stop at midnight, with 2 trash bags in the rain, Elise knew she was standing on the wrong side of that line. She took out her phone. The screen lit up, raindrops sliding over the glass. She dialed the number from the card 1 digit at a time, her fingers shaking, not from cold. Then she pressed call. Cale answered after half a ring. Not because he'd been waiting for this call, but because he was the kind of man who never let a phone ring more than once, no matter the hour. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't ask why she was calling at 1 o'clock in the morning. He heard the rain behind her voice, heard the breathing she was trying to keep steady but couldn't quite steady, and he said only 3 words. "Where are you?" Elise gave him the name of the bus stop. Cale hung up. 12 minutes later, the black car pulled up in front of the shelter. Brennan was in the driver's seat and didn't turn around when Elise opened the back door, only reached over and turned the heat up to the highest setting. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the 2 black trash bags Elise lifted into the car with her. He didn't look at the wet hair stuck to her face, the rain-soaked t-shirt clinging to her thin shoulders, or the slight tremble in her hands as she clicked her seatbelt. Brennan knew when silence was the right thing, and tonight was one of those times. The car moved through Brooklyn, past streets slick with reflected light, and Elise sat in the back seat with the 2 trash bags beside her feet, staring out the window at nothing but rain sliding down the glass. She didn't ask where they were going. Maybe she was too tired to ask. Maybe she'd already decided. And once you decide, questions don't change anything. The car stopped in front of a building in Williamsburg. Not the fanciest part of the city, but clean and quiet. A 5-story red brick place with an iron fire escape running down the front. Brennan handed Elise a key and gave her the apartment address. 3rd floor, number 34. His voice short and professional. Not one extra word. Elise took the key, lifted the 2 trash bags, and climbed the stairs. She opened the apartment door and stood on the threshold for a few seconds before stepping inside. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a living room connected to the kitchen, a private bathroom, clean, basic furniture but complete, a bed made with fresh sheets, a kitchen stocked with pots and pans, a refrigerator that, when she opened it, held milk, eggs, bread, a few simple staples. Better than any place she'd ever lived. Better than her peeling wall studio. Better than the apartment with a door that locked from the outside where she'd spent 2 years with the man who hit her. Better than a bus stop in the rain. She set the trash bags down and stood in the middle of the room, and then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Cale was outside the door. She looked out and saw him standing there, still in a black suit, but this time he didn't carry the coldness of the man at the head of a meeting table. He carried something else, the look of someone who had come for a reason. He wasn't hiding behind power, and he stayed outside the door. He didn't step in. His arms hung at his sides, his posture straight, but his feet didn't cross the threshold. He looked at Elise, then at the room behind her, then back at her, and he said, his voice even, calm, but carrying something Elise had to listen for to recognize as sincerity. "This apartment belongs to one of my legitimate companies. You can stay as long as you need. No one will bother you here." Elise watched him, a man standing outside her door at almost 2 a.m, a man who could have walked in whenever he wanted because the place was his, and he didn't. She'd lived with a man who treated her door like it was his, who came and went without asking, who locked it from the outside when he felt like it. And the man standing here now, the man Joe said was mafia, was waiting outside to be invited in. Cale went on, still standing there. "I have an offer. Mrs. Daly, the nurse who looks after my father, wants to retire. I need someone to be with my father. Not a nurse, not a maid, just someone who's there with him." He paused for a second, then continued, and his voice softened, slowed, the voice of a man speaking the most important thing he knew how to say. "My father likes you. He called you Margaret and he smiled. You should know, my father hasn't smiled at anyone since my mother died. 4 years, not one smile, until he met you on that Brooklyn sidewalk. I can hire anyone, but I can't hire sincerity. No one can buy that." Elise stood in the middle of the apartment, looking at Cale in the hallway, and she spoke without anger, without accusation, only with the flat truth she needed to say before she took another step. "I know who you are, Cale. I Googled you." Silence. Heavy. Cale didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't explain. He looked at her, and he didn't deny it. He didn't try to say the press got it wrong, that it was a misunderstanding, that he was just a normal businessman. Instead, he said, each word clear, "I won't deny it, but that has nothing to do with my father. My father is a 72-year-old man in house slippers, walking into the street at midnight looking for his wife. And that has nothing to do with you. You helped my father because you're a good person. I'm offering you this job because my father needs you. Those 2 things have nothing to do with what you read on Google." Elise looked at him standing outside the threshold, hands down, eyes steady, not looking away. The most powerful mafia boss in half of New York City, standing in the hallway outside a small apartment in Williamsburg, waiting for a bar server to say yes. She thought for a long time. Or maybe it was only seconds, but it felt like a long time. Then she nodded. "Not for the money," she said, her voice small but clear. "Not for this apartment. Because he called me Margaret. And that was the first time someone truly needed me since my mother died." Cale didn't say anything else. He gave one small nod, short and final, then stepped back into the hallway. His footsteps on the wood were so quiet they were almost nothing, and he didn't look back. He didn't cross that door. The days that followed moved to a rhythm Elise had never known in her life. The rhythm of peace. Every morning she arrived at the Upper East Side townhouse at 8 o'clock, rang the bell, and Mrs. Daly opened the door with the relieved smile of someone about to rest after an overnight shift. Arthur was usually already sitting in the chair by the living room window, wearing the white shirt Elise had learned to button correctly for him each morning, house slippers embroidered with the letter A, his hand touching the gold watch on his wrist, the watch whose glass Cale had replaced, though Elise didn't know that. Every time Elise walked in, Arthur looked up and he smiled. He didn't always remember who she was, but he always smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile the body remembers even when the brain forgets, the kind of smile Cale had said he hadn't given anyone in 4 years. They took walks in Central Park on afternoons when the weather was nice, Arthur moving slowly, his hand resting on Elise's arm, telling her about Margaret. She liked tulips more than roses, he would say. People gave roses, but Margaret said tulips were more honest because they didn't try to be beautiful and were beautiful anyway. Then he would talk about Cale as a little boy, and every time he did, his eyes lit in their own way. He cried all the time, you know. When he was 4 or 5, every time he fell he cried, and Margaret had to pick him up and sing to him before he would stop. Now he doesn't cry. Never. I worry about him. A man who never cries isn't a strong man. He's a man who's forgotten how to be sad. Elise listened, nodded, asked questions, and never interrupted him. 20 minutes later, Arthur told the exact same story again, the same voice, the same eyes, the same smile, when he said Margaret and tulips. 20 minutes after that, he told it a third time. Elise listened all 3 times as if it were the first. She didn't get impatient. She didn't glance at her watch. She didn't say, "You already told me." She listened because for Arthur, each time was the first time, and she respected that. And if she was honest with herself, she listened because she wanted to. Because stories about Margaret and Cale as a boy, about Sunday mornings at the bakery, about tulips and the gold watch, were stories about a family, and Elise had never really had one. She taught Arthur how to color. She bought a big box of crayons and thick drawing paper, set it on the living room table, and sat beside him every afternoon. Arthur's hand shook. His coloring went crooked. The color spilled outside the lines, but he loved it. He colored carefully, slowly, his tongue sticking out slightly when he concentrated, and when each drawing was finished, he wrote in the bottom corner in shaky letters you could still read, "For Margaret." Elise pinned every drawing to the living room wall, beside the wedding photo, beside the picture of Cale as a boy, and Arthur looked at that wall and smiled as if she were somewhere watching. Cale and Elise crossed paths in short moments. Few words, but heavy ones. Cale usually came home late, after 10 at night, when Elise had already gone back to the Williamsburg apartment. But sometimes he came home earlier, and she was still there. One time, Elise was teaching Arthur to color in the living room when Arthur spilled the whole box of crayons onto the floor, dozens of sticks rolling everywhere. Arthur panicked and apologized again and again, his hands shaking more than usual. Elise knelt down, gathered each crayon, stacked them back, calm and gentle, not irritated at all. "It's okay, Mr. Arthur. We'll pick them up and it'll be fine." Kyle had just walked in, still in his suit, and he watched. He watched a girl kneeling on the floor picking up crayons for his father with a patience Cale knew he didn't have. Another time, Elise returned to the townhouse near midnight because she'd forgotten her coat. She didn't ring the bell, used the key Mrs. Daly had given her, and stepped inside quietly. And she saw Cale. He was sitting beside Arthur's bed in the bedroom, the chair pulled close, his hand holding his father's hand. Arthur was asleep, but not peacefully, his brow tight, his mouth murmuring Margaret's name. Cale sat there holding his father's hand, doing nothing else, just holding it, and Elise saw his face then. No suit, no power, no steel. Only a son afraid of losing his father. She backed away from the doorway, so quietly Cale never knew she had been there. but peace never stays long. Arthur began to forget more. At first, it was forgetting the name of the picture he'd just colored, then forgetting what time Elise had arrived. Then one afternoon, Elise stepped into the living room, and Arthur looked at her with empty, frightened eyes, shrinking back into his chair, and called out in a trembling voice, "A stranger. Who are you? Why are you in my house?" Elise stopped in the doorway and didn't come closer, her voice gentle, steady even as her chest tightened. "It's Elise, Mr. Arthur. I'm here to spend time with you." Arthur stared at her, and there was nothing in his eyes that recognized her. No smile, no Margaret, only fear. That afternoon lasted a long time. By the end of the day, Arthur recognized her again, called her Margaret, smiled, but Elise knew that afternoon had been a sign. The door was closing. Slowly, but surely. Cale knew too. A doctor called him one evening, and the call wasn't long, but after he hung up, Cale stood by the penthouse window looking out at the city for a long time, not speaking, not moving, only standing there. Brennan was behind him, watching his boss's back, and he knew the news was bad, because Cale only stood that still when he was trying to keep something from breaking inside. The illness was progressing faster than expected. That was what the doctor had said. Faster than expected meant the afternoons Arthur recognized Elise would become fewer. Faster than expected meant the stories about Margaret and tulips would disappear. Faster than expected meant that one day, Arthur would look at Cale and not know who he was, not for one afternoon, but forever. But Alzheimer's doesn't wait for anyone. And what happened next was the moment no one saw coming. That day arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, without warning, without fanfare, with nothing different from any other afternoon except that when Cale walked into Arthur's bedroom at 2 o'clock, his father looked at him and didn't know who he was. Not the kind of forgetting that turned into remembering the way it had before. Not the kind where the eyes went dull for a few seconds and then lit when he heard his son's voice. This time Arthur looked at Cale with eyes that were completely empty. The eyes Cale had been afraid of seeing for 4 years. Eyes that didn't hold him inside them. Cale sat down in the chair beside the bed, the chair he'd sat in for hundreds of nights, and he took his father's hand. "Dad, it's me. It's Cale." Arthur looked down at the hand holding his, then up at Cale's face, and he pulled away. Not a gentle pull, a jerk, fast and panicked. The jerk of someone who'd just touched something strange and frightening. Arthur pressed his back into the headboard, eyes wide, and he said in a shaking voice Cale had never heard his father use with him, "Who are you? I don't know you. Please don't touch me." 3 sentences, 14 words, and every word was a blade cutting deeper into Cale than anything he'd ever endured in 36 years of life. He sat there with his hand still lifted where his father's hand had been, and he didn't know what to do. The man who controlled half the city, the man whose raised eyebrow could silence a room, was sitting beside his father's bed and didn't know what to do because his father didn't recognize him. Cale tried once more. "Dad, I'm Cale, your son, Margaret's son." But when he said Margaret's name, Arthur's eyes didn't brighten the way they always had. He only stared at Cale, still afraid, still distant, and turned his face to the wall. Cale stayed another 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. He spoke to his father in the gentlest voice he could manage, told him about Margaret, about the bakery, about tulips. But Arthur didn't turn back. He lay facing the wall, curled in on himself like a child afraid of the dark, and Cale was the dark. Finally Cale stood. He stepped into the hallway, closed Arthur's door softly, and leaned his back against the wall. The corridor was quiet, the light a soft white. Paintings on the walls, polished wood underfoot. Everything was beautiful and expensive and meaningless. Cale stood there with his back to the wall, head tilted back, eyes lifted to the ceiling, and for the first time in 4 years, for the first time since the day Margaret died, his eyes turned red, not crying. Cale Maddox didn't cry, but his eyes were red, wet, and he bit down on his lower lip hard enough it nearly bled to keep anything from breaking loose. Brennan stood at the far end of the hallway. He saw it. He didn't speak. He only stayed there, guarding the space so his boss could be weak for 30 seconds without anyone else seeing. Then the doorbell rang. Brennan went to answer it, and Elise walked in. She hadn't been called. No one had called her. Today wasn't a day she came early. She usually arrived at 8 in the morning and left at 6 in the evening. But this afternoon she'd gone back to the Williamsburg apartment, sat on her bed, and felt something was wrong. She couldn't explain it. only a heaviness in her chest, the kind of heaviness she'd felt the night her mother died, before the car flipped, before everything changed. Instinct. She called it instinct because she had no other word for it. And she came. Elise saw Kale in the hallway, back against the wall, eyes red, and she understood immediately without anyone saying a thing. She didn't ask. She only gave Kale a small nod as she passed, then opened Arthur's door and stepped inside. Arthur was still turned to the wall, curled in. Elise didn't speak for the first few seconds. She pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and placed her hand on Arthur's hand, light, not gripping, only resting there, letting him feel warmth without feeling trapped. Arthur didn't pull away. He didn't turn back, but he didn't pull away. Then Elise began to tell a story. She told him about Margaret, about the bakery, about Sunday morning. She liked croissants straight out of the oven, Elise said, her voice soft and slow, like a lullaby, the crust golden and crisp, the butter shining. She would break it in half, one half for you, one half for herself. She used to say, "This half is for you, this half is for me," just like everything we have. They were stories Arthur had told Elise hundreds of times, 3 times an hour, each time like it was the first. And now Elise told them back to him, with the exact words he'd used, with the exact rhythm he'd spoken them in, because she had listened closely enough to memorize every detail. Arthur listened in silence. His body slowly uncurled, no longer folded tight. His hand, the hand that had jerked away from Kale, now slowly turned back, and his fingers closed around Elise's hand, weak but deliberate. Elise kept going. About the tulips Margaret loved, about Kale at 4 years old who cried so easily, about the gold watch from their wedding day. Arthur blinked, then blinked again, and something lit in eyes that had been dark all day, a brief flicker, like a candle flaring in a dark room just before the wind snuffed it out, but real in that moment. Arthur turned his head away from the wall and looked at Elise. He looked at her for a long time, a very long time, and Elise looked back, holding his hand, not breathing, not moving, waiting. Then Arthur opened his mouth, and his voice was strangely clear, clearer than it had been even on his best days, clear as if the fog in his mind had parted for a moment to let a thin beam of light through. Elise. Elise couldn't breathe. This was the first time Arthur had said her name correctly. Not Margaret, not the girl, not a stranger. Elise, her name, her real name. "You're very good, Elise," Arthur said, his voice still clear, his eyes still bright, and he squeezed her hand a little tighter, with the strength of a 72-year-old man. Not much, but enough for her to feel it. "Thank you for being here." Then the light went out. Slowly, like a candle burning down to its wick. Arthur's eyes dulled, his pupils widening, and he looked past Elise instead of at her, toward something farther away, where Margaret was, where the bakery was, where Sunday morning was, where the world he was sinking into still existed. "Margaret," he whispered. Then he closed his eyes. Elise sat there holding Arthur's hand, and she cried. Silently, tears ran down her cheeks and fell onto the backs of their joined hands, and she didn't wipe them away, because wiping wouldn't stop them. She cried because he remembered her name, because all day he hadn't remembered anyone, hadn't even remembered his own son, but he remembered her. And she cried because she knew that moment would not come back. Outside the room, Kale stood there. He had been there since Elise began to tell the stories, his back against the doorframe, his eyes still red, and he heard everything. Heard her telling his father's own stories, heard his father say her name, her real name, for the first time, heard her crying without sound beside his father's bed. Kale's hand gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, and he understood. She wasn't doing this for money. Not for the apartment. Not for him. She was doing it because she needed Arthur too, the way Arthur needed her. Because Arthur was the father who sat with her each afternoon, told her stories, smiled when he saw her, held her hand when he was afraid. He was the father Elise had never had in 27 years of life, and she was losing him, just like she had lost her mother. Slowly, but surely. The next morning, for the first time in many years, Kale Maddox didn't go to a meeting. He didn't call anyone. He didn't text Brennan about the schedule. He didn't open his laptop, Lang. He didn't read messages. He woke at 6 o'clock, lay still for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, then got up, pulled on a t-shirt and pants instead of a suit, and went down to the kitchen. The kitchen in the Upper East Side townhouse was wide and modern, filled with the most expensive appliances money could buy, and yet it had almost never been used. Margaret had cooked here every morning. After she died, the kitchen became the kind of room people walked through, but no one stopped in. KL opened the refrigerator and took out eggs, bread, butter. He set a pan on the stove, turned on the flame, and stood there watching the butter melt, then cracked the eggs in. He didn't know how to cook. He had never made breakfast in his life, because when he was young, Margaret cooked for him, and when he was older, he paid someone else to cook. And he had never once imagined there would come a day when he would be standing in a kitchen at 6 a.m, trying to fry 2 eggs without burning them. He burned them. The whites browned at the edges. The yolks broke because he flipped them clumsily. The toast was fine. The coffee was fine, but the eggs were burned. He placed everything on a tray, added napkins, added a glass of water, and when he turned around, Brennan was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms at his sides, eyes a little wider than usual, the eyes of a man witnessing something he had never seen in 8 years of following Cale. Cale looked at Brennan, then at the tray in his hands, then back at Brennan, and didn't explain. He carried the tray upstairs, walked down the hallway, reached Arthur's room, pushed the door open with his shoulder, because both hands were full, and stepped inside. Elise was already there. She had arrived at 6 a.m, 2 hours earlier than usual, because after last night she couldn't sleep, because every time she closed her eyes she heard Arthur's voice saying her name, clear and warm, and she was afraid that if she didn't come early, by the time she arrived he would remember nothing at all. She was sitting beside Arthur's bed, her hand resting on his, and when she looked up and saw Cale come in carrying a tray of food, she didn't speak, only tilted her head slightly, a small tilt that had become, between the two of them, a way of greeting without words. Arthur was awake. He lay turned toward the window, his eyes cloudy, and when Cale set the tray down on the table beside the bed, Arthur turned back, looked at the tray, looked at the browned eggs, looked at the toast, looked at the coffee, and then looked up at Cale, and he smiled. "You cooked," Arthur said, his voice rough from sleep but warm, warmer than it had been yesterday, warm in the way only someone who had recognized his son again could be. "The eggs are burned just like your mother's used to be." Margaret didn't know how to fry eggs either. That was a secret she didn't want anyone to know. She cooked everything well, except eggs. Cale stood by the bed with the tray in his hands, and he smiled. A small smile, almost invisible if you didn't watch closely. But Elise watched closely, and she saw it. The three of them ate breakfast together, Arthur propped against pillows in bed, Elise in the chair on the left, Cale in the chair on the right. The eggs were browned at the edges, but Arthur finished them. The toast was broken into 3 pieces, the coffee shared between Arthur and Cale. Elise drank water. No one talked much. Arthur told a little story about Margaret and burned eggs, laughed in the middle of it, forgot the ending, then kept eating. Cale sat quietly, drinking coffee, occasionally looking at his father, occasionally looking at Elise. Quiet, ordinary, the kind of ordinary most people get every morning and never think to call precious. But for the 3 people in that room, this breakfast was the most precious thing they had been given in a long time, and there might not be many breakfasts like it again. Arthur finished eating, his eyelids grew heavy, and he fell asleep again, his hand still resting on Elise's, his mouth slightly curved into a smile. Cale stood, watched his father sleep, then stepped out onto the balcony off the living room. Elise lowered Arthur's hand gently onto the bed, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and followed. They stood out on the balcony looking over the city. Morning in Manhattan, early sunlight, the sound of cars below, birds on the opposite rooftop. Cale leaned on the railing, eyes fixed in the distance, and he said in a low, slow voice, as if he had been carrying the sentence for a long time and only now could let it out. "That night in Brooklyn, you didn't just save my father. You know that." Elise stood beside him 1 step away, her eyes on the city too. She didn't look at him when she answered. "You don't need me to remind you. You just need to remember you're Arthur's son." Cale went quiet. Then he took something from his pocket, something Elise had never seen before but recognized immediately. The gold watch. But the glass had been replaced, clear as water, no crack running across it anymore. The gold rim had been polished brighter, but it still held the small scratches of 46 years on Arthur's wrist. Cale turned it over. The 4 words were still there, sharp and clear. M and A. Forever. He held the watch out to Elise. Put it on my father when he wakes up. It'll make him happy. Elise took the watch in both hands. It was heavier than she expected. Or maybe it was heavy because of what it carried. 46 years of marriage. Sunday mornings at the bakery. Croissants broken in half. Half for you and half for me. Tulips instead of roses. A woman named Margaret who had loved a man named Arthur enough to engrave the word forever into the back of a watch. And forever turned out to mean that even when she was gone, he still searched for her every night. Elise held the watch in her palm and felt its weight. And she looked at Cale. And Cale looked at her. And neither of them said anything more. Because nothing more was needed. A girl with nothing stopped on a Brooklyn sidewalk to help a lost old man. She didn't know who he was. She didn't need to. She stopped because 8 years ago, no one had stopped for her mother. 11 minutes. No one stopped. And her mother died for 5 minutes. She didn't save him because he was the father of someone powerful. She didn't save him to be repaid. She saved him because he was someone's father. And she understood the value of that better than anyone, precisely because she had never had it. Sometimes the smallest actions change everything. Not because we know what will come, not because we calculate the outcome, but simply because we choose to stop when the whole world keeps walking. If this story touched you, if it made you pause for even a second and think about the people who stopped for you, or the times you stopped for someone else, then please hit like so we can keep telling stories like this. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today, because sometimes a story at the right moment can change the way someone sees the world. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Who did it remind you of? What moment in your real life did it bring back? Leave a comment below. We read every comment, and we want to hear you, to hear what you feel deep in your heart, because the best stories sometimes aren't the ones we tell, they're the ones you share. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.